It was a warm afternoon in a quiet little neighborhood. The sun was shining and the streets were calm, with only the occasional sound of birds or the distant laughter of children playing. James Carter, a 72-year-old man, slowly stepped out of his small, neat house. He walked with a slight stiffness in his knees, the kind that comes with age. But there was a strength in the way he carried himself. His back was straight, his head held high. James wasn't just any elderly man. He was a veteran, a man who had once worn the uniform of the United States Army with pride. His years of service had taken him to faraway lands, through moments of danger and sacrifice. He had given his youth to protect the very freedoms that people in his country enjoyed every day. And now, in his later years, he lived quietly, enjoying simple routines. That afternoon, James wore his old army cap, the one he had kept for decades. The fabric was faded, and the stitching had started to fray, but to him, it was more than just a cap. It was a piece of his history. His jacket had a few patches from his military unit, each telling a story of a time when his life was very different. James decided to take his usual walk to the corner store. He liked going there, not because he needed much, but because it gave him a chance to stretch his legs and greet a few familiar faces along the way. As he walked down the sidewalk, he nodded politely to neighbors who were watering their gardens or sitting on their porches. Some knew him well enough to wave and call out, "Afternoon, Mr. Carter." And he always responded with a gentle smile. The streets were peaceful. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, and the smell of freshly cut grass floated in the air. James passed a group of children riding their bikes. One of them, a little boy, stopped and stared at James's cap. "Were you in the army, sir?" "Ha," he asked shyly. James chuckled softly and replied, "Yes, son, a long time ago." The boy smiled and pedaled away, clearly impressed. For James, moments like that made his day. He liked to think that maybe a child seeing his cap would feel curious about history, about the people who served, and about what it meant to stand for something bigger than yourself. As he neared the store, James thought about buying some bread and maybe a newspaper. He liked reading the paper in the evenings, even though most people got their news from the internet or TV now. It was part of his old-fashioned way of life, something that gave him comfort. His steps were steady, but slow. Age had changed his body, but not his spirit. Inside, he still felt like the strong young soldier who had once stood in formation with his brothers in arms. He had seen battles, faced fear, and lived through moments that had shaped the man he became. And though most people in his neighborhood knew he was a veteran, they didn't know the details of what he had done or the sacrifices he had made. He never boasted about his service. To him, it was enough to live quietly, to enjoy the sunshine, the smell of flowers, and the sound of leaves crunching under his shoes. Life had slowed down, but that didn't bother him. He had earned this peace, but that peaceful afternoon was about to take a turn. James didn't know it yet, but in just a few minutes, the quiet streets and friendly nods would be replaced by tension and confrontation. His walk to the store, something so ordinary and routine, was going to become a story that strangers would talk about for days. For now, though, he continued his steady walk, his mind drifting to thoughts of his son, Marcus. He hadn't seen Marcus much lately since his son was often away on duty. Marcus was in the military too, but not in an ordinary role. He was part of an elite unit known only to a few. James was proud of him, more than words could ever express. He knew his son's training, skills, and bravery were unmatched. But he also knew Marcus carried a heavy burden. The work Marcus did was dangerous, often secret, came with risks most people couldn't even imagine. James smiled faintly at the thought of Marcus surprising him with a visit. It had been a long time since they'd shared a meal together, just father and son, talking about life. As he approached the corner, the little store came into view. He could almost smell the faint aroma of coffee and fresh bread from inside. The afternoon sunlight glinted off the windows, making them shimmer. Everything seemed normal, calm, and safe. But life has a way of changing without warning. In that peaceful moment, James had no idea that two police officers in a nearby patrol car had noticed him. He didn't know they were already making assumptions, forming ideas in their minds based on nothing more than his appearance. He didn't know that in just a few steps, his calm afternoon would turn into something entirely different. Something that would test not only his patience, but also bring a side of his life into the open that the world wasn't expecting. For now, James took another slow step forward, unaware that his ordinary walk was about to become an extraordinary story. James Carter had just turned the corner, and it was only a few steps away from the small store when a patrol car rolled slowly up the street. The low hum of the engine caught his attention, but he thought nothing of it. He was used to seeing police in the neighborhood from time to time. Still, something about the way the car slowed down, matching his pace, made him glance sideways. Inside, two officers sat watching him. Their eyes followed his movements in a way that didn't feel casual. James kept walking, his hands by his side, his steps even. After years in the military, he had learned to notice when someone was sizing him up. And right now, he could feel it, the weight of their stares. The patrol car suddenly pulled over ahead of him, blocking part of the sidewalk. James sighed softly. He had a feeling about what was coming next. One of the officers, a tall man with a sharp jawline and sunglasses hiding his eyes, stepped out first. The second, shorter but heavier set, followed close behind. They walked toward James with a purposeful stride, their hands resting casually but noticeably near their belts. "Hey, you there," the tall one called out. "Can we talk to you for a second?" James stopped. He had nothing to hide. "Sure," he said calmly, his voice steady. But curious, the shorter officer glanced him up and down. "We've had reports of a suspicious person matching your description walking around this area. What are you doing out here?" James blinked, slightly taken aback. "I'm walking to the store. Live 2 blocks over. You have ID on?" "You?" the tall one asked, his tone not polite, but clipped as if this was already a problem. "Yes," James replied. He slowly reached into his pocket, moving carefully to avoid giving them any reason to think he was doing something sudden. He handed over his driver's license. The tall officer snatched it and began reading it closely, his jaw tightening for no clear reason. "James Carter," he read aloud, almost like he didn't believe it. "You say you live nearby?" "I don't just say it," James answered calmly. "It's true. I've lived here for over 20 years. The shorter officer stepped closer. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Tall, older, wearing a cap." James almost smiled at the absurdity. "That could be half the men in this neighborhood," he said quietly. The tall officer's lips thinned, just answering some questions. "Don't get smart." James could feel a familiar tension building, the kind he had experienced in military situations where misunderstanding could lead to danger. He reminded himself to stay composed. He knew how quickly things could escalate around them. A few people began to notice what was happening. A young woman on her phone slowed her walk, pretending to check her messages while sneaking glances. A man outside the store paused mid-step, his brow furrowed. The shorter officer decided to push further. "What's in your jacket?" he asked. "My hands," James said, holding them out to show they were empty, and nothing else. "Just my jacket. Mind if we check?" the tall one asked. But it wasn't really a question. His hand was already half extended, ready to search. James's chest tightened. This wasn't a random, friendly check-in. This was profiling, plain and simple. He could feel the sting of disrespect, not just to him, but to the years he had served for this country. "I do mind," James said evenly. I've done nothing wrong." The taller officer took a small step forward, his tone growing harder. "We're just doing our job, sir." "Then do it with respect," James replied, his voice low but firm. The short silence that followed was thick with unspoken challenge. James could tell they weren't expecting him to speak up so directly. It wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening. But he wasn't bending either. The shorter officer smirked, as if amused by the idea of an elderly man standing his ground. "Look," he said, "we can make this easy, or we can make it hard. Your choice." James didn't flinch. He looked at both officers, calm but unwavering. "My choice," he said slowly, "is to be treated the way any law-abiding citizen should be treated." That's when one of the bystanders, the young woman with the phone, quietly began recording. Another man across the street also lifted his phone. The officers noticed, and their eyes darted toward the cameras for just a moment. But before anything else could happen, James heard footsteps approaching fast from behind. They were heavy, confident, and familiar. In the back of his mind, a realization began to form. He turned his head slightly and saw a tall figure in running gear moving toward them with purpose. His heart gave a small jump. He knew that stride anywhere. It was Marcus. The air around them seemed to grow heavier. James could feel the eyes of strangers on his back now, their curiosity slowly turning into concern. The two officers stood in front of him, blocking his path completely. It wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It had become a slow, deliberate act of control. The tall officer still had James's ID in his hand, but instead of handing it back, he stared at it for longer than necessary, as if searching for a reason to keep him there. The shorter officer had shifted his stance, his feet apart, one hand resting on his utility belt, the other tapping against his leg like a silent warning. James knew this dance. He had seen it before, not here in his neighborhood, but decades ago in other parts of the world, in uniform, when soldiers tried to intimidate civilians. The goal was the same, to make the other person feel smaller. "Mr. Carter," the tall one said finally, "you say you're a veteran." James nodded once. "That's right. Mind telling me which branch?" The officer's tone wasn't out of curiosity, was testing him like he was trying to catch a lie. "United States Army," James replied, his voice steady. "Served in Vietnam, 8 years active duty." The shorter officer let out a low whistle, but not in admiration. "That's so? And now you just hang around the neighborhood?" James tilted his head slightly. "I live here. I walk here." "That's not a crime." The tall officer's lips twitched into something between a smirk and a sneer. "We'll decide." "What's suspicious?" Those words hit James harder than he expected. "We'll decide" was the kind of statement that reminded him of every injustice he had ever witnessed, the times when authority forgot its duty to serve and protect. From the corner of his eye, James noticed the young woman still holding up her phone, recording every second. A man across the street had moved closer, pretending to tie his shoe just to get a better view. The presence of cameras was making the officers slightly more careful, but not enough to stop the slow intimidation. The shorter one decided to press. "The moment, lift your arms. Let's do a quick pat down." James's chest rose slowly as he took in a deep breath. "No," he said clearly. "You don't have probable cause, and I've committed no crime. You will not touch me." The words were calm, measured, but there was steel in them. That steel only seemed to annoy the tall officer, whose fingers tightened around the ID card. He took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. The shadow of his frame fell across James's chest. "Sir, don't make this difficult." In that moment, James's mind was racing, not with fear, but with control. Years of military discipline had taught him that losing your temper was the fastest way to lose the fight. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. But just As the tension reached its breaking point, a deep, steady voice cut through the air behind them. "What's going on here?" It wasn't loud, but it carried a certain weight, the kind of voice that made people turn before they even knew why. Both officers glanced over their shoulders. James didn't need to. He already knew who it was. Marcus was standing a few steps away now, his breathing just a little heavier from the run, but his posture solid and unshaken. He wasn't wearing a uniform. There was something about the way he held himself, straight-backed, balanced, eyes locked, that made it clear he was not an ordinary passerby. "Sir, this is a police matter," the tall officer said quickly. Straightening up, Marcus's gaze shifted from the officers to his father, then back again. "Then explain it," he said evenly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're harassing a 72-year-old man for walking down the street." The shorter officer opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus took another step forward, not threatening, just present. And in that single step, the atmosphere began to change. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The steady, deliberate way he spoke made it clear he was not someone who could be brushed aside. The tall officers shifted uncomfortably. "And you are?" Marcus kept his eyes locked on them, his jaw firm. "I'm his son." The words hung in the air for a moment. It was such a simple statement, but there was something in the way Marcus said it. Not loud, not boastful. It's matter of fact that made both officers pause. James looked at his boy, and even after all these years, he still saw the soldier in him. Marcus had the same unshakable presence James once had in his prime, but amplified, sharper, more dangerous, like a blade honed to perfection. The tall officer tilted his head, trying to read Marcus. "Your father's free to go once we clear this up. We're just clear what up?" Marcus interrupted, his tone calm but edged with steel. "You have no reasonable cause to stop him. He hasn't broken any law. You've detained an elderly veteran without justification. That's illegal, and it's harassment." The shorter officer frowned. "Look, we're just doing our job. You don't know what's going on." "Oh, I know exactly what's going on," Marcus said, stepping closer. His eyes never wavered, his voice never cracked. "I've seen this before. I've dealt with men who hide behind authority to intimidate. I've seen it in war zones, and I'm seeing it right here in my hometown." The taller officer's mouth twitched into a smirk, as if trying to brush it off. "And where exactly? Have you seen all this?" Marcus didn't blink. "I've spent the last 15 years in the United States Army's 1st Special Forces, Operational Detachment Delta. We call it Delta Force. You might have heard of it." The words hit like a stone dropping into water, silent at first, but rippling outward in every direction. The taller officer froze for a fraction of a second. The shorter one's face changed too, just slightly, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. The onlookers, phones still recording, began whispering to each other. Marcus's voice stayed steady. "My unit has handled missions your newspapers will never write about. My team goes where others can't, and we finish what others won't. I've led men into battles in the dead of night, where one wrong move means no one comes home. And I promise you," his gaze locked on the taller officer, "know exactly how to handle a threat when I see one." It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even a threat. It was simply the truth, delivered by a man who had spent his adult life making life-and-death decisions. James stayed silent, watching his son with quiet pride. Marcus rarely spoke about his work. It was classified, most of it. But in this moment, he was peeling back just enough of the curtain to make these men understand exactly who they were dealing with. The taller officer swallowed, trying to regain control. "We didn't know that's the problem," Marcus cut in. "You didn't know, and you didn't care to know. You saw an elderly black man walking, and you decided that was suspicious. That's not policing. That's profiling. Other words landed hard. The crowd was larger now, more phones pointed in their direction, more people listening intently. Every second of this was being captured. The shorter officer glanced at his partner, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He took a half step back, his hand moving away from his belt. Marcus didn't move closer, but he didn't step back either. He stood his ground like a wall. His father's honor, his family's dignity, that was his mission now. And this was one mission he would not lose. The street was quiet, but the kind of quiet where every sound mattered. The faint hum of the patrol car's engine, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the block, all of it seemed to fade behind the thick silence that had settled between Marcus, his father, and the two. Officer Marcus had fully closed the distance now, standing at his father's side. He didn't touch him or speak to him yet, not because he didn't care, but because he was assessing the situation with the same precision he'd used in the field. His eyes scanned the scene the way a seasoned soldier scans a battlefield, noting where each officer stood, how their hands moved, and where the crowd was positioned. James glanced at his son out of the corner of his eye. He could see that familiar calm, the same calm Marcus had even as a boy, long before he ever wore a uniform. It was the calm of someone who never acted without purpose. The taller officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The change was small, but Marcus noticed. It was the kind of movement that said, "I'm not as sure as I was a moment ago." The shorter officer's eyes darted toward the growing crowd, then back to Marcus, like he was calculating the odds. "Sir," the taller officer said, his voice just a little tighter now. "We had a report of someone matching your father's description." "We were just," Marcus cut in, "not with volume, but with presence." "You were just what? Detaining him? Questioning him like he's a criminal? Searching for something that isn't there?" His words were calm, but they hit like well-placed strikes, each one leaving less room for the officers to maneuver. The shorter officer spoke up this time. "Look, we didn't know he was your father." Marcus's eyes narrowed and his voice dropped lower. "It shouldn't matter if he's my father or a stranger you've never met. He's a citizen. He's a veteran. He's a man walking to the store in his own neighborhood. That's all you need to know." James stayed silent, letting his son take the lead now. He'd dealt with enough in his life to recognize when someone else had full control of a situation. Marcus was no longer just his boy. He was the kind of man you'd want on your side when everything was on the line. The crowd around them had grown. More phones were out, more whispers running through the air. A few people looked at Marcus with recognition, not because they knew him personally, but because they recognized the way he carried himself. Marcus finally turned to his father, his voice softening slightly. "You okay, Dad?" James nodded once. "I'm fine, son. But..." His eyes said something else. "I'm proud of you." That small exchange between them only deepened the silence from the officers. It was clear now, they were not in control anymore. Marcus looked back at them, his tone level but his words sharp. "You have two choices right now. You can apologize to my father, return his ID, and walk away. Or you can escalate this, and I promise you, it will not end the way you think." The taller officer's jaw clenched. The shorter one seemed to hesitate, glancing at the phones in the crowd again. They both knew the reality. Every second of this was being recorded, and every second made them look worse. Still, neither moved right away. It was as if they were both wrestling with the decision, caught between their pride and the truth standing in front of them. And Marcus just stood there, steady, unblinking, unshaken, the way only a man who had been through the worst could stand. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to end this. The silence on the street felt like a held breath. The crowd had grown to nearly a dozen people now. scattered along the sidewalk and across the street, their phones angled just enough to capture every second. No one said a word, but their eyes were fixed on the scene, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus took a slow step forward, closing the last bit of space between himself and the two officers. He didn't tower over them physically, but his presence made the taller man straighten his back, as if instinctively trying to match him. It didn't work. "Return my father's ID," Marcus said quietly. It wasn't a request. The taller officer's fingers twitched around the card. For a moment, he looked like he might refuse. But Marcus didn't break eye contact, didn't move, didn't even blink. His stillness carried more weight than shouting ever could. After a few long seconds, the officer handed the ID back to James. The movement was reluctant, almost grudging, but it happened. Marcus didn't thank him because this wasn't a favor, this was his father's right. "Now," Marcus said, his voice just a fraction lower, "you're going to explain in front of all these people why you stopped him." The shorter officer shifted uneasily. We got a call about a suspicious person in the area. Older male, dark jacket, army cap. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Suspicious. Because of what? Because he's walking down the street. Because he's black. Or because you're looking for a reason to exercise authority where none is needed. The officer opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The crowd shifted, the air heavy with anticipation. Marcus's tone sharpened, each word measured and deliberate. "Do you have any idea who this man is? This is Sergeant James Carter. He served in Vietnam, put his life on the line for this country before either of you were born. He came home, raised a family, and lived with honor every single day since. And today, you thought it was acceptable to treat him like a suspect instead of a citizen." The taller officer's jaw tightened. "We didn't know he was." Marcus stepped in, cutting him off without raising his voice. "It shouldn't matter." Those 3 words hung in the air like a hammer about to fall. I've seen men stare down enemies in combat and treat them with more respect than you've shown my father today, Marcus continued. I've been in places where a wrong move meant death, where you had to rely on the person next to you with your life. And I'll tell you right now, neither of you would have made it there with the way you carry yourselves here. His voice wasn't angry, it was deadly calm. And somehow, that was worse. The shorter officer looked away, his gaze falling to the ground. The taller one shifted his stance, suddenly unsure. Marcus took one final step forward. His voice quiet but impossible to ignore. "You don't have to like me. You don't have to like my father. You will respect him. And if you ever try something like this again, if you so much as glance at him the wrong way, I'll make sure every single person in this city knows exactly what happened here today. And I'll make sure it's the last time you wear that badge." The street was silent, except for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. The officers didn't answer. They didn't move. Marcus leaned back slightly, his posture relaxing, but his eyes stayed locked on them, making sure they understood. The power in the moment had shifted completely. They knew it. The crowd knew it. James knew it. And now, the only question left was whether the officers would back down, or make the mistake of pushing further. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. The 2 officers stood frozen in place, their authority stripped away in front of a growing audience. The taller one's jaw was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. The shorter one shifted from foot to foot, like he wanted to disappear. Marcus didn't move, didn't need to. His words still hung in the air like a weight pressing down on both men. Around them, the crowd had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Every phone stayed raised, every camera still rolling. The taller officer's eyes flicked toward the onlookers, scanning the faces, realizing that every second of his hesitation was being documented. It wasn't just Marcus's words he had to worry about anymore. It was the dozens of little red recording lights blinking in his peripheral vision. Then it hit him. This wasn't going away. Not later tonight, not tomorrow. If this got out, and it would, his name, his face, and his actions would be tied to the story of two cops harassing a black veteran. And worse, the veteran's son wasn't just anybody. He was a soldier whose reputation alone could crush him in the court of public opinion. The shorter officer cleared his throat and glanced at Marcus, his voice quieter now. "Sir, we, didn't realize." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "Didn't realize what? That he's my father? That he's a veteran? Or that you were wrong from the start?" The officer hesitated. Maybe we approached this the wrong way." The taller one finally spoke, his voice flat but lacking the edge it had before. "Sir, Mr. Carter, we apologize for the misunderstanding." The words were forced, heavy in his mouth, but he said them. James stood quietly, his weathered face unreadable. He wasn't the type to gloat or spit back anger, even when it was deserved. He simply gave a short nod, as if to say, "You're done here." The crowd began to murmur again, some shaking their heads, others whispering about what they'd just seen. A few people lowered their phones, satisfied they had enough footage to tell the story later. The younger ones still recorded, knowing this was the kind of clip that would spread far beyond the block. The kind people would watch again and again. The taller officer took a half step back. The shorter one followed. Neither looked like they wanted to be there anymore. Their earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by something more fragile, the awareness that they had crossed a line. They couldn't uncro. Marcus finally broke the silence. "You can go now." It wasn't loud. It wasn't a request. It was an order, and the remarkable thing was, they obeyed. Without another word, the two officers turned, walked back to their patrol car, and drove away. The hum of the engine fading until it was gone completely. For a moment, no one moved. Then the first voice broke through a man in the crowd, calling out, "That's how you handle it." Others murmured in agreement, and a couple of people clapped quietly. Marcus turned to his father, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. "Since he'd arrived, let's get you home, Dad." James nodded, his lips curling into the faintest smile. He didn't need to say anything. The look in his eyes said it all: pride, gratitude, and a quiet kind of relief. As they began walking, the crowd slowly dispersed, people still talking in hushed tones. Phones went into pockets, but the story was already alive, carried by the witnesses who had seen a simple walk to the store turn into something unforgettable. The officers might have left the street, but they wouldn't be able to leave the memory of what had just happened and who they had just faced. The streets slowly returned to normal, but the air still carried the echo of what had happened. People who had been silent spectators now spoke in low voices, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others still buzzing from the confrontation. A few lingered, watching Marcus and James walk away together, father and son, side by side, a picture of dignity and strength that no one would forget anytime soon. As they turned the corner, the noise of the crowd faded behind them. The neighborhood seemed calm again, but for Marcus and James, the stillness was heavier now, filled with thoughts that neither spoke right away. They walked in silence for a while. James's steps were slower, but not from exhaustion, from reflection. His mind went back to his younger days, when he wore his own uniform and faced situations where respect wasn't given, only earned. He had seen the world at its best, and at its worst. Yet today, in his own quiet neighborhood, he had felt a sting he thought he had left behind decades ago. Marcus kept his pace matched to his father's, scanning the surroundings out of habit the way he always did. Even off duty, his mind operated like a soldier's, watchful, ready. But his thoughts weren't on threats. They were on the moment they had just lived through, and the look in those officers' eyes when they realized who they were dealing with. When they reached James's house, Marcus opened the gate for him. "You okay?" he asked again, softer this time. James nodded, then glanced at his son. "I'm fine, Marcus." "You didn't have to step in like that, you know?" Marcus's mouth curved into a faint smile. "I did, Dad. I always will." James looked at him for a long moment before stepping inside. "You've been through a lot in your life," he said, quietly. "I've seen that, but today, you reminded me of something. It's not just about being strong, it's about knowing when to stand." Marcus didn't answer right away. He knew his father was right. His entire career had been about facing danger, missions in places most people had never heard of, nights where one wrong move meant no one made it home. But this was different. This was personal. That evening, the videos from the confrontation started to circulate online. It began with short clips on social media, just a few seconds of Marcus standing in front of the officers, his voice steady, his presence unshakable. Comments poured in. Words like hero, legend, and respect filled the feed. Others focused on James, on his quiet dignity, on the injustice he had faced in broad daylight. Within hours, local news outlets picked it up. By morning, it wasn't just a neighborhood story anymore. It was a citywide conversation. People debated policing, racial profiling, and the treatment of veterans. Marcus's name wasn't in every post, but those who knew. And those who didn't could feel there was more to the story than what the cameras had captured. James didn't chase the attention. He stayed in his home, sitting by the window with his morning coffee, watching the street outside as if nothing had changed. But he knew things had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone who had seen the truth with their own eyes. When Marcus stopped by later that week, they didn't talk about the incident much. They didn't need to. They had both been there. And they both knew what it meant. As Marcus was leaving, James called out to him. "Son?" Marcus turned. "Yeah." James's voice was low but steady. "I fought for this country. I just wish it fought for me." Marcus stood there for a moment, his eyes meeting his father's. He didn't have an answer. Instead, he gave a slow nod, a soldier's nod, and left. The weight of those words staying with him long after the door closed. And in the quiet that followed, the world outside kept moving. But somewhere out there, the story of that afternoon, the story of a black veteran, his son, and a moment of truth on an ordinary street kept spreading, carrying with it a lesson about dignity, respect, and the silent power some families hold.